Well, a lot of big stories in the country over the week, and even this weekend. We saw earlier the valedictory session of the Ninth Senate, which is signaling the end of the legislative business for the Ninth Senate. I mean, in the course of the week, there were still conversations around the fuel subsidy removal, with conversations around the leadership of the 10th National Assembly. But by far the biggest story this week has been the suspension of the CBN governor, Godwin Emefiele. Thanks for joining us. This is Standpoint. I am Precious Amayo. Now, it didn't come as a shock to a lot of people just before the close of the day yesterday, when Nigerians thought that, look, the day was over. We had that breaking news from the presidency that President Bola Tinubu has suspended Godwin Emefiele as central bank governor with immediate effect. And that was sequel to the ongoing investigation of his office and then the planned reforms in the financial sector of the economy. We're going to talk about this and then also talk about the economic policies of the president going forward. And to help me have that conversation, we're joined in the studio by the former Director General of SCCI and now the CEO of Center for Promotion of Private Enterprise, CCPE, Muda Yusuf. Good to have you join us.
Thank you, Precious. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Now, let's talk about this because, you know, just before that election, Emefiele became the face of the ill-timed, many Nigerians said, Naira redesign policy. Some held him responsible being the CBN governor. And then some also, you know, there were jokes around his names. A lot of things happened in that period. But now that he has been suspended, how are economic stakeholders like yourself reacting to the suspension?
Well, first, let me say that the suspension did not come as a surprise. It was only going to be a matter of time. I say this because during his inaugural speech, the president outlined his major policy thrusts as far as monetary policy and related matters are concerned. And he also said that there was going to be a thorough house cleaning of monetary policy, which by extension means house cleaning of also the institution that manages the monetary policy. So going by that, we knew that something was going to happen. And he went further to state categorically his policy convictions and policy direction. First, he said that the unified exchange rate must be discontinued. That the CBN must, put a stop to that. Secondly, he expressed his displeasure or his resentment about the way the Naira redesign policy was managed. He talked about the need to reduce interest rates. I'm saying all of this for us to be able to situate the key differences between President Tinubu's policy thrust and direction and the disposition of the current CBN governor. The current CBN governor is not a believer in a unified exchange rate regime.
And so that relationship was never going to work?
Yes, that was a major issue. Because in the business environment, this has been seen as one of the major distortions in the economy and one of the biggest impediments to the growth and recovery of the economy. But the CBN under Emefiele does not share that view. So for close to 8 years, we have been stuck with this multiple exchange rate regime. Secondly, we had the Naira redesign policy. Now, up till now, we don't even know where we stand on that. Because we are not seeing an increase in the new currency, and the old currency currently accounts for over close to 90% of currency in circulation. So we don't even know where we stand. So, of course, the president also expressed his displeasure about that. And from what we can see, the CBN also still has the conviction that that is the way to go. Because it took the Supreme Court. It took the intervention of the governors. It took the intervention of even the National Assembly for us to have a review of the timeline for the Naira redesign, in spite of the cries and the pains and the agonies and the trauma that the citizens suffered.
Perhaps,
so if you have...
we're seeing reactions like that, I mean, when you look at the reactions from Nigerians, you would see that some of them are expressing some level of, I don't want to use the word joy, but, there's sort of satisfaction with this particular suspension because they say that, look, they went through a lot because of that Naira redesign policy. But we know that political decisions have direct influence on economy. How is the market reacting to this particular suspension? And what do you think that the impact would be on the Nigerian economy? Well,
it's still early days. This suspension was announced on Friday. Markets will begin to, react effectively from Tuesday. That is when the working day resumes. But generally, the perception is that to the extent that we need to undertake some critical reforms in the monetary policy space, and to the extent that we need some changes even within the CBN itself, in line with what President Tinubu said, I think the perception is that something positive will come out of this. I say that because some of these policies that the president wants to reverse are policies that have been having very negative effects, both on the economy, on investments, and on the welfare of the people. So the outcome for me is likely to be positive. And again, this will also help to position the administration to be able to accelerate the pace of reforms in that space. Because it is impractical to expect somebody who doesn't believe in your philosophy of economic management to drive it. The governor of CBN does not believe in some of these fundamental policies that Asiwaju is bringing into place. So therefore,
but
there's
to be
a
clear,
major...
That's not why, sorry to interrupt you, that's not why he's been suspended, just so people are not thinking that, look, he was suspended because of that clash in policy. No, he was going to leave office anytime soon anyway. In a few weeks, he was going to be out of office. But this is basically about investigation, around his office. And I will let you continue now, but also we just want to ask you, because many policy analysts and economists have said, look, that Naira redesign policy was the last straw. That there have been a lot of other policies, before now that they didn't think were right and they were also ill-timed. But, some have considered him the worst CBN governor in the history of this country. Do you agree with that assertion?
Well, I don't want to be that judgmental. But I would say that some of the policies are some of the worst policies that we have seen coming from the CBN, particularly the Naira redesign policy. It was extremely very bad because it affected the economy very badly. And what even made it worse was the inflexibility and the insensitivity around it. When we saw situations where the ordinary people were crying on the streets, people could not access their own money from the banking system, people were using Naira to buy Naira. Use your digital currency to buy the currency notes. And the cost of purchase of the currency was even higher than the cost you pay if you are borrowing from the bank. So it was one of the worst things that happened under the Buhari administration. And unfortunately, even President Buhari himself did not respond the way we expected him to respond. We don't know the kind of feedback he was getting. But it was very unfortunate that it happened the way it happened. So if you look at that singular policy, perhaps you may be forced to agree with some of those who said it was one of the worst regimes of central bank leadership that we have. But even the foreign exchange policy too had a major distortionary effect on the economy. And a lot of players in the economy have complained about this. Most of the international financial institutions have complained about it. Some technocrats within the country have complained about it, but for some reasons, both himself and President Buhari stuck to that for this foreign exchange policy, which was not transparent. It was creating a whole lot of transparency issues in the financial market. It became highly transactional, and it's more importantly, it impeded the inflow of investment into the economy, because we saw a crash of FDI to less than $500 million. We used to do close to $5 billion, $6 billion, dollars of inflow of FDI in the years before the administration. The exporters also were very, bitter about the policy, because yes, this is a time we needed to encourage the exporters to bring in money into the economy. But you have a policy that says that when you are bringing your export proceeds, you have to bring it at the official rate, which was 461 or 460. That is like penalizing the exporters. So there's a whole lot of inherent contradictions.
Whereas you could have gotten your exchange, even in a higher, higher rate, and then you have to now bring it in a lower rate, which means that, that's a lot of loss.
It's a loss of close to 200 to 250 naira per dollar.
Considering that the naira at that time was exchanging against the dollar at almost 750.
Yes.
So imagine bringing it in for 461.
Yes,
you're right that, so that's a lot of
that affected our quest for inflows of investment. And when we complain about this exchange rate and the challenges we are having in the foreign exchange market, it is to a large extent as a result of that policy. Even some of the transactions that were taking place, some of them were taking place under the table or underground. Some of the foreign exchange transactions were taking place outside the country. There are some exporters that were shipping their produce to the neighboring countries to go and export, just because of this policy. And a lot of people have complained about it, but the CBN governor is not somebody that listens. And unfortunately, because that is my personal view, and his level of engagement with stakeholders is extremely very low and very weak. He doesn't come across as somebody who is inclusive in his approach to solving a problem. So that is why we find ourselves in this kind of situation.
That inclusion, it's what I want to talk about, because you have talked about how himself and President Buhari stuck to that Naira redesign policy. And many are wondering why, whether he should solely take the fall for what appears to be a failed policy. Because some say, look, his role is to advise the president on financial matters, come up with financial policies, and also advise the president, on those policies. That there are people within the presidency who should have advised the president even better. And, there is also a CBN management team who could have also, raised the alarm if they felt that something was wrong. And so if nobody did that, why is he taking the fall solely?
No, talking about the CBN management team, when you have an overbearing boss and that has so much powers, there is very little those of you that are subordinates can do. The option that you may have sometimes is just to walk away from the job. So he's such an overbearing person. That is my own perception of him. So that is somebody that is difficult to disagree with. And when you are in a management situation and you have that kind of boss, you just have to let it be, or let him be. That is one on the because he's the CBN governor. He's also the chairman of the board. So you can imagine the enormity of the powers that he has. So to expect that a major reform or a major influence can come from within, especially when you are dealing with somebody who has the strong conviction that he's doing the right thing, we'll be expecting too much. Now, on the side of the presidency, the president has a presidential economic advisory team. And the team is made up of quality members whom a lot of us respect. But what I was saying is that within the presidency itself, I don't think the advice or the input of these committees are being sought. Once an idea comes from the CBN to the president, and the president believes in it. That's it. So I'm not seeing the impact of that team, economic advisory team. I'm not also seeing the impact of even some of the key ministries, economic ministries.
Minister of Finance, who wasn't aware.
Exactly. We have economic planning. We have investment, trade and investment. Ideally, the input of such people also ought to have been sought. That, okay, what is the wider implication of this policy? So I think by the nature of the management style of President Buhari, that did not happen. So that is why I think whatever comes from the CBN just gets straight, approved for implementation. And I don't think there is also a very strong mechanism for feedback. Because ideally, if you introduce a policy, from time to time, that you should have a monitoring and evaluation framework to be able to determine the effectiveness of the policy, whether you are having a backlash, whether it's achieving results, and so on, so that from time to time, you can fine-tune the policy. That did not happen. So the framework of economic management under President Buhari was not such that can allow for the distilling or the fine-tuning of ideas that come from one or two agencies of government. And again, we have the National Economic Council. They also were not playing the kind of role that they should play. And again, because, we also had something that looked like an imperial leadership. So that if President Buhari takes a position on an issue, many people hardly want to disagree with him. At least that is my own impression of that administration. Once he takes a position, not even the National Assembly wants to disagree with him. So because of that, and because, of course, he's not an economist and he also had limited knowledge about how these things work, he meant well, no doubt. But some of these things are scientific in nature. There are some theoretical bases that can support the sustainability of policy. If you don't give room for that kind of technical input to inform policy choices or the shape of policy, you can easily go wrong, no matter how well-meaning or how well-intentioned you are. So those are the things I think went wrong in the policy process. It's not for lack of people within the space, but if you are there as an expert and your ideas are not sought, or you give your ideas and your boss doesn't listen, what are you going to do? So you have to let it be. So going forward, I think we should take a cue from that and ensure that going forward, we ensure that the policy process is more rigorous. It's not just about one or two people coming with ideas and you just run with it. No. You should have a team that should properly scrutinize it without necessarily being bureaucratic. These things it doesn't take time. Once you see a bad policy, you can smell it from kilometers away that this policy is not going to work. Because economics is a science, even though it's a social science.
And all policies are really about people, and if people that have been affected negatively by your policy.
Exactly.
It's a no-brainer that you should decide to rescind, that policy. But let me ask you about his perceived political affiliation, partisan political affiliation, and then these allegations coming from the DSS. How unprecedented is that for a CBN governor?
Well, his involvement in partisan politics, I think is something that was most unbecoming. I've never seen anywhere in the world where somebody who is occupying such a very strategic position will get involved in partisan politics. I've never seen it. And it's also incredible that we allowed that to happen. Again, I will put that at the door of the president. How can we have a CBN governor degenerating to a point of taking forms to contest the primaries of a political party? At a time, I thought it was a joke, personally, that this cannot happen. Well, before we knew it, we saw branded buses in his name. We saw a group of all these people who gathered themselves in Abuja addressing press conferences, supporting this candidate and that candidate, support groups for him. And at a point, he even went to court to ask for a declaration of the court that he wants to remain as the CBN governor and still be part of the presidential primaries. I've never seen that kind of thing anywhere in the world. So it's unprecedented. I don't know how we got to that point, that somebody like that, in that kind of position. So that in itself has compromised the credibility of the institution. Because it's an institution that should be able to work with any political party that comes to power. It's an institution that should be able to relate with any candidate that emerges eventually as the president of the country. But that has been massively compromised by the involvement in partisan politics. And you know the implication of that for the credibility of even the economic policies. That was why even during the Naira redesign, ministers were read into it. That maybe he had some, political motives that he wanted to achieve. He has put himself in that position. Got to a point that even INEC said INEC was not going to store the sensitive materials in CBN custody. It got to that point. It was most ridiculous. So things like that can, result in this kind of outcomes that we are seeing. Because how do you now work with an administration that has come in? You have it's a very messy, very messy situation. So that, of course, is likely to be a factor because you have already tainted yourself as a politician, which should not be. So that for me is also an issue,
But how? Because you mentioned how powerful that office is. One wonders, how do you check such powers? One would think that the powers to check that office resides with the president, but we didn't see that at play in the last administration. So how do you check that kind of power that the CBN governor has?
Well, there are a lot of suggestions, or a few suggestions that have been bandied around. He's the CBN governor, and he's also the chairman of the CBN board. Perhaps we should separate it. Because, we used to have something similar in the banks. When you have a CEO of a bank, who will also be chairman of the bank. I think it was Sanusi that reviewed that.
During the banking reform era.
Yes. So I think something similar will have to happen because, if you have too much powers, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. If you have too much power, there's a very high risk that you can also mismanage those powers. Unfortunately, the National Assembly also had a role to play in their oversight function. They have a committee on banking and finance.
He was summoned several times and did not appear until eventually.
He did not appear because, again, you have a feeling that even the members of the assembly were already compromised. And that is one thing even the new National Assembly should watch out for. If you have a responsibility to oversight an institution, you have to be careful the kind of favors you get from such institutions. Emefiele was very contemptuous of the National Assembly, extremely contemptuous. He took the decision of the House of Reps Speaker to pronounce that he was going to issue a warrant of arrest for him to show up at the House of Reps. The Senate did not even invite him. Even as bad as things were during this Naira redesign, when the citizens who they were representing were crying. Some people died. I didn't see that kind of firmness of action on the part of the National Assembly. So when the National Assembly gets itself compromised, it weakens its own authority to be able to actually play its role as representatives of the people. So I will advise the incoming National Assembly, to be careful not to get themselves compromised over any committee that they have the responsibility for oversight. So that when it comes to the time for you to put your foot down and correct certain things, you have the moral authority to be able to do that. But at that time, it was clear that the moral authority was not there. So, National Assembly has a role to play to check any excesses of any agency of government. That is why they are there. But the structure of the CBN too, I think, needs to be reviewed.
So I would just put you on hold because, I mean, this conversation is way bigger than the CBN governor himself. We're going to take a break. When we return, I want us to examine the economic policies of the president. And that's when we return. Thank you so much for staying with us, Mr. Muda Yusuf. We'll take a break now. When Standpoint returns, we'll broaden the conversation and look at the economic policies of the president. Stay with us.